I'll show you page number 4 in particular. So this is one of the greatest discoveries in history. I think it's probably inarguably the greatest discovery of the 20th century, and that's one of the greatest discoveries in modern history. So out here were the Essenes. The Essenes are a group of people. One of the think about the major sects in Jesus' day. It was the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. The Essenes, they originated around 100 years before Christ, but were done at the time of the revolt, so at about 70 AD. So there's not a massively extended period of time that the Essenes were active. They're not mentioned directly in the Bible. Some things we know about the Essenes is that they clustered in these monastic communities, primarily, generally excluding women, so it's just men. They held everything in common, very socialistic in everything was the communities. There was never a large number. In the first century, the estimates are maybe up to 4,000 Essenes. They very meticulously observed the law of Moses, the Sabbath, ritual purity. It was a huge thing for them. So you will see when we go through here, if they're following meticulously the law of Moses, the Sabbath, ritual purity, what are you going to see a lot of going through this?
Mikvahs.
A lot of mikvahs, a ton of them. As you walk through, you'll see them. Unlike the Pharisees, though, they denied the resurrection of Jesus. They denied the resurrection, not just resurrection of Jesus, but resurrection of the body. They also refused to immerse themselves in public life. So the Pharisees lived separately, but were out among people condemning how they lived. The Essenes were condemning how people lived, but from a distance. And they would come out here to a place like this. They didn't go to the temple. The Essenes didn't go to the temple because they thought temple worship was too liberal. So they didn't want to have anything to do with it. They were content to live this life of seclusion in a place like this. The Sabbath was reserved for day-long prayer, learning of the Torah, the 5 books of the Old Testament, first 5 books. There's always these questions about, was John the Baptist an Essene? Because little things like, he lived in the wilderness. His dietary habits were different. We have no record of him being an Essene. There's some people that try to say he was for a period of time. We just don't know. But we do know John the Baptist was not. He didn't avoid. He didn't go and separate himself from everyone. He was very confrontive of the culture and very much immersed in people's lives. So was he or not? We don't know. Now the Essenes, so they were not just concerned that Jewish worship had become liberal, that religious Jews were all liberal. They were no longer following God the way He intended. The other thing they were concerned about is the copying of the scriptures. So in 586 BC, Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians, and they were carried off to Babylon, including articles from the temple, and it was burned. And a lot of the scrolls that were kept at the temple, a better place to keep copy of the writings of Scripture, were burned up and gone. And so about 70 years later, the Jews come back, of course, from Babylon, from exile. And when they came back, they began this process of, we can't let Scriptures disappear, so we need to come up with a system of copying the Scriptures. And so the Essenes were very committed to the copying of Scriptures. And that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls were so important. But not just because we needed copies of the Scriptures, but it did something very significant for us. The Essenes were incredibly careful they had really, really strict rules about how they copied the Scriptures. I found a list of the Masoretes. When the Masoretes were copying Scriptures, which would be like 5th to 8th century, they had a list of rules. So this is the Masoretes' list of some of their rules, and the Essenes' rules would be similar. Let me just read this to you. This is according to Jewish and Talmud tradition. Each skin has to contain the exact number of columns, which must be equal throughout the entire manuscript. The length of each column must be between 48 and 60 lines. The breadth of each column must consist of 30 letters. The ink must be black only and had to be prepared according to this very special recipe. Originally, when they would make a copy, they had to use an original. They couldn't use a copy. Whatever the original was, the latest document they had, the earliest document they had, it had to be copied from there. I couldn't take one that Tyler had written, copied from him. He and I needed to use both the same source. And you were to say every word out loud as you wrote it. It was crucial not to miss any word. No word or letter was allowed to be written from memory. Even if you had memorized the Torah, you were to read it, say the word, write it. There was to be a hair or thread of space between each consonant. 9 spaces or breadth of a hair, the length of the breadth of a hair between each section. No word was ever to touch another. There were to be 3 lines between every book. Incredible rules. The 5th book, the Law of Moses, Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Law of Moses had to end at the end of an exact line, a full line. Before writing, they would go through the ritual mikvah. They would wash themselves before they would start copying. If you ever were writing the name of God, you had to write it. You had to dip it in fresh ink so that there wouldn't be a break in the name. When you came to the name for God, you had to wipe your pen clean, and then you had to go dip yourself in the mikvah before you would write the name. That's what the Masoretes required. And then I love this phrase: should a king address a scribe while writing that name, he must take no notice of him. You're writing the name of God. If there was a mistake, then that sheet was to be condemned. If there were 3 mistakes, then they condemned the whole manuscript. They would just assume there were a lot of mistakes that copyist had made. Each scroll was checked within 30 days, or it was considered unholy. And they would count every letter and word. And there was much a supervisory system. The supervisor knew the middle letter and middle word of every manuscript. And so when it was finished, one of the ways they would check is they'd have someone count the words and tell me, what word 5,321 is, and they would tell them, and if it wasn't the right word, then the manuscript was off and it would be destroyed. So that's how careful they were at copying the scriptures. So this all happened, and then the Jewish revolt comes, and they get wiped out. Before they get wiped out, they're getting news of the Jewish revolt. They're getting news that Rome is coming. They're getting news that things aren't going well. And they begin to take all of these writings and storing them in jars and hiding them in caves along the face of this mountain. And it was 1947. It was a teenager, a goat herder. He's just walking along, coming to the end of the day. He's just doing what teenagers do, throwing rocks. And he threw a rock in a cave that is now known as cave number 1. And he hears shattering. And he thought, that's interesting. But it was also late, and he and his 2 buddies had to get home. So he told them, we're coming back because we're finding treasure tomorrow. There's treasure hidden in that cave, and we're going to go find it, and we're going to become rich. So they come back the next day, and they go in, and they see these jars. You will see some of the jars in the Israel Museum. And they break them open, and they were incredibly disappointed to see it was just handwriting inside of these. Thought they were worth nothing. And of course, that ends up becoming the Dead Sea Scrolls that are just so crucial. So here's why the Dead Sea Scrolls, here's why they're so important. So what they found that was scripture. I'll just talk about scripture for now. There's other things they found. They found copies of the writings between the testaments that are not in our Bibles, but are in that's kind of telling the history between the end of the writing of the Old Testament and the New Testament. They also found a ton of the writings they found are their own rules and their lifestyle. Here's what we eat. Here's what we do. But the third, and what's most important to us, is they found copies of the Hebrew Scriptures. Here's why it's important. These writings took place between a couple hundred years before Christ and a decade or two after Christ. That's where the copies are. So let's assume that the last writing of an Old Testament prophet was approximately, let's say 400 years before Christ. The earliest manuscripts, in 1947, the earliest manuscripts we had of the Old Testament were about 1,000 years after Christ. So in other words, I've talked about this before, and we've talked about the beauty of archaeology that answers some of the criticisms about the Bible. You can imagine, before 1947, you're talking in the 20th century, where one of the greatest, if not the greatest attack on Christianity was the reliability of the Scriptures. And it was common for people to say, the earliest copy we have of the Old Testament is from 1,000 years after the Old Testament was finished being written. Who in the world can imagine how many times has it been copied, and then more copies, and then more copies, and then more copies? There is no way it is accurate. It can't be close to accurate. 1,000 years, and that frankly is a pretty reasonable argument. And what the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls did is it took that distance from about 1,300 years since the end of the writing of the Old Testament down to a couple hundred years or 300 years. It shortened it by 1,000 years. Then what you do, if the earliest copies we have were approximately 1,000 years after Christ, and now we have copies from the time of Christ, you can then compare those two documents and say, the accusation about the accuracy of the original writings has been around a long time. Now we'll be able to see at least how accurate the copies are over a 1,000-year period of time, right? And that's why it's so significant, because there is hardly a difference. They were so careful about the copying of the Scriptures, all of those 1,000 years, that there's hardly a difference. In fact, when we get to the Israel Museum, I'm going to show you two of the biggest differences that the Dead Sea Scrolls made in understanding in us what we have today. In fact, what I'll do is I'll have one of you look up on your phone. I'll have you read it out of the King James, and then I'll read it out of a modern translation, and I will show you the two biggest differences. And frankly, it will surprise you if those are the two biggest differences. That's why the Dead Sea Scroll discovery is just so significant. Because it really, what it did is it totally removed, among scholars, it removed the argument about what we have. No scholar is going to argue that it's not what was originally written. Now, people that aren't aware of the Dead Sea Scrolls or aren't aware of the arguments may still make that argument. Now the argument's changed. Now the argument has changed to it's not inspired or it's not inerrant. But decades ago, that wasn't the argument. The argument was it's not even accurate. The accuracy argument is gone because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you're going to have a chance to look at some of the Dead Sea Scrolls in a couple of days in the Israel Museum. So I want to take you over. I'm going to just kind of walk you through a path that you can kind of see how they lived. You will see I'll make some comments as we go. So let's walk. I'll take you over to the cave.